You're listening to the official podcast of the Westside Vineyard in Los Angeles, a community of individuals and families connecting with God to change the world.
And what does it mean to have faith, live by faith? It's kind of this idea that draws us, faith, but it also eludes us so often. And the writer of Hebrews says that faith is taking hold of the things that we don't yet see, that are real, but we don't necessarily see. And it's faith that is penetrating our life so that it affects the way that we live. So we live not out of something other than reality. Faith is not there's faith and then there's reality. No, faith is a larger reality. And it penetrates. And it says, the writer then goes on to say in verse 2, and this is what the ancients were commended for. This is what those who God first engages and they begin to say, oh, is this God? And they follow him. This is what they ultimately lived out, and that we should look to them. And then it begins to mention them quickly and kind of references them. It's like kind of this hall of fame, some would say, of faith. And so we're looking at those lives and looking at the faith and the qualities and what we see out of them. And that's what we're engaging now. So it's real life, real faith, because we need real people who are not like the heroes that you look at, and they're nice inspiration, but you live vicariously through them. So you think, oh, I feel like I have faith because I read about faith. No. They are not merely here to inspire. They're here to call us into that life. And what does it really mean to join them and enter into the reality of faith? And that's what we're engaging. And so last week we looked at the first that's presented, which was Abel. And for those who aren't familiar, there's the brothers who at the very start, the first set of brothers, Cain and Abel, and we're told how they brought these offerings to God. And one of them, Abel, was brought the best, and how he seemed to really honor God and grasp that, and he had faith to to give the best and bring the best. But his brother rises up in jealousy, and it's kind of that sign of what happens to the human soul that immediately happens when humanity is separated from God, and one of them suddenly feels jealous. They don't feel rooted. God doesn't love me. I don't feel rooted. And out of jealousy, you recall, that Cain rises up and he strikes down his brother. And you see this act of violence, but the violence starts to show even how dark it is within it, because with the violence comes this defiance. Because God comes to him and says, what have you done? Where is your brother? And you remember what he says? You may remember if the story. Am I my brother's keeper? He's basically saying, get out of here, God. He's totally defiant to God. God is saying, yes, you were your brother's keeper, and look what you've done. And you see this quick outset of humanity's violence and defiance, and it just begins to unfold. And humanity sinks deeper into this place of where that total responsiveness to God and relationship with God is being lost. Deeper into this sense of depravity, deeper into this kind of place of destruction. And this is where we kind of pick up and we meet God in the storyline that we hear of the stories of the Old Testament, where we see God reach this point in Genesis 6. You can follow on screen, or if you have a Bible, look in Genesis 6, verse 5, where it says, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become. And at every inclination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil all of the time. You hear, if you could think into those words and you see that every, all, only, you begin to recognize this is something that has reached, we say, the point of no return. This was not only the point of no return, it was the point of no restoration, no repair. There was nothing that could be done. There's nothing left. That's the kind of idea that you get here. Something's been so corrupted that it can't even simply be restored. There's nothing to work with. I remember once taking photographs from a trip or from travels when I had lived abroad, and I thought, gosh, I'm finally going to get these in. Now, this will age me a little bit. They actually had, there was actually film at one time, and you actually took it and they put it in chemicals, and that actually, processed the film. And so I took it to this store that did that, when there were stores back then. And they did that, and I was excited because I knew what these could be, and I'm like, this is great. I knew I had a lot of great pictures that had been taken over this time. And when I showed up to get them, they said, we're so sorry, but we put them in the wrong chemical and they're all just ruined. And I'm like, there wasn't about an apology at that point. You can't restore it. They couldn't put it through another chemical and get it back. It was corrupted at that level. And I knew what it could be. I knew what was there, but it's not there anymore. It had been immersed in the wrong thing. And there is this sense in which this corruption that is so fundamental it can't be restored is in humanity. There's this level of where they have found themselves at. And it says those with whom there is, what does it say? Every inclination of the thoughts. Only evil all of the time. There is nothing left that is responsive in the human soul. And many of us think, well, I can't really imagine that. There's always that which can be redeemed. But the scriptures tell us no. It's not something maybe any of us have ever seen. But the human heart ultimately can reach a point in which it has lost all responsiveness, cut itself off so deeply from such things that we become like a compass. And the compass is made of something magnetic, just a little pin that's magnetic, but the force of the earth is magnetic, so it responds to it. But if it loses all of its magnetism, there is no response. The small will no longer respond to the large magnetic field. And we can become like that. It's this point in which humanity is describing, has reached a point in which there is nothing left. There is no magnetism. It's given it up. It's given it away. And it has made itself unresponsive. And so at this point, one is coming upon that. There's nothing to engage in that. And you can imagine God perhaps a bit akin to like a farmer who he goes out into the fields after he's done all the sowing and all of the seeding of everything, and he's waiting. But then comes the rains, the torrential rains, like the monsoon rains, and it goes on until he knows that there's nothing going to be left. It will all rot under that amount of water. Or maybe a freeze, where the freeze comes and he knows it cannot survive. And that when it's time to go out, what he'll find is he's probably going to have to call in the hands and say, plow the whole field up. There's nothing left here. Unless what? Unless he could go out and maybe find something that's still alive, and then he could use that to reseed and restart. So it is, God goes out and he looks, and this is where we pick up and we engage our next hero of faith. It says then, that in Genesis 6:8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of God. And this is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless amongst the people of his time, and he walked with God. We see this one man whom God sees, one man whom God calls, one man whom we're going to engage. Wow, the uniqueness of him, what he has to face, this one man, and what unfolds is this life of faith. As God comes and says, I'm going to wash the earth in this flood. I'm going to be those around you, those whom you know, there is nothing left to work with. You'll have to meet me in grace. I'll provide a way for you of grace. And then I must wash the earth. And so we have the story of the flood that many are familiar with, and it's also the story of faith. And there's much debate about the flood, and there's much that is being engaged all the time and fascinating. There are, from a geological point of view, there's those who say, well, there's evidence. This evidence that talks of the historicity of this flood, and others say, well, I don't know about a worldwide flood and the evidence of that. There's those who look upon the idea of, well, why are there flood stories in a few other cultures around the world too? Maybe that questions the origin of the story of the flood. And others say, actually, it supports the story of the flood, because why would other cultures also speak of a great flood? And there's those who look at the language here and say, actually, the language doesn't say the whole earth. It really could mean it's a regional flood and something much smaller, something more engaged. I encourage you, dig in and engage those things. But my point today is not to engage all that around the flood, but to focus on the person who we see and we're told is at the center of it, the faith that Noah coming and being told that you are the one I will work with. You're the one who I'll meet in grace. And he's all alone in that. And that's what beckons us, and I call us into it. Noah becomes this means for the mercy of God. God's heart, God is saying, look, my heart can move forward with humanity because of you, but you're it. And I think in some ways we should feel that too. I want my grace to reach out to humanity, but you're it. I'm going to work my heart through you. Are you ready? Are you ready to let my heart work with you? Are you responsive? Are you obedient? Are you on? Are you going to join up? You can just imagine kind of Noah, God meeting him in this. And what qualified him? What is it that made Noah stand out? We might say, oh, well, he had a number of degrees that he had gotten, And it's like, no, he had he got a PhD in boat building, No, he had a doctorate in redemption history, no. That he went to a life change seminar, and no, none of it. Nothing. All we're told is that he was blameless, which in the scriptures when they say blameless, it doesn't mean that he wasn't a man full of flaws. No. It doesn't mean he didn't have sin. It just meant that he was one whose ultimate disposition and integrity was still right, so people could not point to that fundamental wrong. And what makes him distinct and what becomes so clear is there's a responsiveness. Where others had seared off their entire conscience and responsiveness to God, he had not. He had not. And so there was still something in him that would respond to God. And that responsiveness it's so vital for us to appreciate and to protect. Because it says that all of humanity had gotten to the point where they had lost everything. There was nothing left in them. And I think you and I think, well, I can just kind of live my life cavalier and, hey, you know what? At the end, when things are really going down, I'm going to get, then I'll kind of, line myself up. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't. And we need to take heed to that. C.S. Lewis says this profoundly when he says that every time you make a choice, you are turning the control part of you. Every time, every little choice, the ones we've already made today, some we're conscious of, some we're unconscious of, but in every one, you're turning part of you that chooses into something that's a little different from what it was before, and taking your life as a whole with all of your innumerable choices, you are slowly turning this control thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish one. And I believe there's profound truth in that. That actually, with every little choice, you can't say, oh, well, I'm going to kind of whatever. I'm going to do my selfish, indulgent thing here, kind of blow off God. But it's fine because that's just, tomorrow I'll just make a different choice. You never simply do that. With every choice, it affects the way you relate. It affects something inside of you. And I'm not saying we can overcalculate it, but I think we know something of this truth. And so we take heed to kind of think that we can see where one people end up with nothing responsive, nothing left that could respond. They had been hellish. And by hellish, it means one who says, I want to live and rule my own life. That's what hell is. There's nothing left. You're outside of all that is of God and good. That is the ultimate darkness, separation. There's nothing left. And the heavenly, that which wants God. And so between you and I, if we get honest, there's a part of us that wants God and a part of us that doesn't. Part of us that wants God to rule, part of us that wants us to rule. And you better decide, because at some point as you navigate those choices, you can land in this place. And what we find is in Noah is that he is one who, his faith, and the first point that I want to make is that faith begins with the posture of our hearts. Faith begins with that posture. It's out of that. He had faith to respond. When others just did their own thing, he was responsive. When others were deaf, everybody around him was deaf to God, he's still listening to God. When everybody else said, whatever, I don't care, he says, no, God is still the center of things. I still make him the center of things. He still had this place in his heart that he kept open. And we do well to ask us, where are we in doing just that? And so it is, as we see that there's this sense of that faith starts in that place, that posture, that disposition towards God. And it's described in the Hebrews text where it says about Noah. It says in chapter 11, verse 7, it says, by faith, and now it's describing to us why we should look to him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, what did he do? In holy fear, or some translations say in reverence, he built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned. It doesn't mean he pointed fingers. It means his life, ultimately, his rightness ended up showing and revealing how they had almost condemned themselves, if you will. He condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that came by faith, that his responsiveness is what made him right. And that's essentially what the text is saying. And it's important for us to realize that it says, by the fact that he was warned, so there was something that happened. God engaged him. And I trust God's engaged you at some level. You've read the scriptures and said, wow, this is engaging me. I feel like there's truth. I think this is the story of life in God. And something arises in you that says, maybe this is reality. Maybe it makes the most sense. Maybe I sense God at work within me. Maybe my spirit is inspired. Some way God has come to you. So there's something of reality and reason, as it begins by saying, he was warned, something happened. But then it says, and what? And through holy fear or reverence. So there's reason, but there's also reverence. There is something that happens, but there's also the posture inside of him that affects that. And out of that, what does he do? Then he builds. I love how Tim Keller kind of puts this together, and I think describes our life and our calling of faith. When Keller says faith begins with understanding, that is something Noah came to understand. Okay, Noah, take a look. I'll make it clear. There's consequences, and the world has lost its way, and it's time for consequence. There's understanding, but then which leads to conviction, and Noah realizes, wow, you're right. That this is true, and I have to now follow that truth. And it completes itself with commitment. So there's understanding, conviction, and commitment. And this is what we see with Noah. You know, he had understanding. Out of that, he had a conviction, a reverence, and a posture, and he makes this commitment. And that's the call to us, that we're going to have to hold all those. The true faith holds all those together. True faith is not just a feeling. True faith is not just reason, but it has reason, understanding. True faith is not just a conviction. It's based on reason, but it's not just the mind. It also then has a conviction, a posture, and then ultimately it lives it out with action. So you have all of this flowing, and you see it in Noah, and you see that Noah protected that posture. And so God comes to him in verses 13 and 15. And so God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all the people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. In other words, they are running this to their destruction. There's nothing left to work with. There's nothing else. But I'm surely going to destroy both of them in the earth, so make yourself an ark. And this becomes this vessel of grace and protection. This ark and cover of cypress wood, make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you're to build it. The ark is to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet higher. Those are the rough calculations by our current way of measuring and speaking. And he goes on to unfold more and more. And basically, he's calling Noah, and you can imagine this, and you've all imagined it or seen the Evan Almighty movie or some of these. But the reality is, you're talking something massive, about a football field and a half long, about a half a football field wide, about 4 stories high. You're talking about this incredible massive thing that couldn't be built. Today it's been built. There's 2 people who they're building one right now in Kentucky, and a Dutch guy built one a few years back, because he wanted the world to really see the reality of what's here. And so there have been these full-size, full-scale models built, but these were built in modern times. You could imagine then, what it would be involved. It would just be overwhelming to imagine the amount of lumber involved. So you're thinking the size and the scope of building something this large. And then comes the whole animal issue, How many animals, sir? You can imagine them thinking that's a lot of all the various kinds pre-flood that there were living. This is an overwhelming thought. You can imagine Noah going, can we have a separate boat, from all the animals, maybe a little yacht, we carry along. This is overwhelming when you think of the size and the scope of this thing, the amount of animals involved. And then you think the amount, and also by the way the animals, it's fascinating to me. I think it's very helpful to us to remember that he turns to Noah and says, and you're responsible for the animals. In other words, we like to separate out our role with creation and say, well, to hell with creation. Let the earth just go to hell. It's all about people. But God had always set humanity as the ones who would be the caretakers of the earth. So I think it's so fitting that we would get reminded that when he goes to Noah and he says, and you need to make sure that you bring about the protection of life of the animals. We do well to hear that. And then with that, he goes on and now says, oh, and it's going to take about 120 years. Oh, excuse me. I mean, that's an overwhelming thought. It's not shocking when you think about that it's just him and his family. There's 8, and probably only a couple of them building this thing for that duration of time would be astronomical. Now imagine that. Just imagine Noah thinking, excuse me? Now, their lives were apparently living much longer, so they have before the flood, you get given dates of lives that were much longer lasting. But this is a long period, and we could go into all the details of that. But I just want you to try to imagine all that he must be facing and feeling at this point. And the enormity of this. And this is not something that he is going to say, all right, we'll take on this little project. We'll do it in the garage, when no one's looking. And we'll put a little blanket over it, And we'll put a little sheet over it and no one will see what we're doing. No, this is something that would be like, the entire, everybody around from everywhere. From not only the local villages, but from everywhere would be seeing this thing begin to come. Who's collecting wood in massive amounts year after year after year after year? This is a lot of trips to Home Depot and a lot of jokes. It's every time you go, hey, we got to sell at umbrellas, you idiot, You believe it's going to rain when there's been no rain. At first it might start fun like that, but it would not remain fun. It would remain adversarial. And from adversarial, it would start to probably grow very harsh. Because what he's doing, he doesn't have to preach anything. What he's doing, represents that he believes that God's bringing consequences. And that is not going to feel comfortable for people who are saying, you're crazy. We do what we want. We rule our lives. We exploit other people. We exploit the earth. And there's going to be no consequences. But that boat keeps telling us that there could be consequences. And I really hate that boat. And I really hate the guy who says that there will be consequences. So you can imagine the tensions that built up, even if he had never said a word. Just because he's saying, no, this is the grace. And anybody's welcome, just because of that. And I'm sure it did grow harsher and harsher. And what we realize here is that, secondly, faith involves the courage to maintain being different. Faith at some point involves the courage to be different, to give ourselves to a different storyline, to say, the world might say this is the story, or there is no storyline, or it's all around. I actually believe that that I'm joining a different story. This is what I believe to be true. And I'm going to live my life fitting into this reality or this story. And that won't always be understood or shared, especially when there's kind of a breakdown and there's kind of a sense of there's no story, or everyone writes their own story. And so we're living in strange times, and he was too. And so that had to have been hard. And you think about it and you think, I can relate a bit. How much harder it must have been for him. Because who was it? Of course, everybody, we all need encouragement, right? To live out being different. Who do you have behind him? No one. There was no one praying for him. There was no one caring for him. There was no one leading him. There was no one following him. There was no one holding his hand. There was no one. If you ever felt alone trying to hold faithfully to things that nobody else seems to understand, it's a very lonely thing. And you've all known it at different levels. Think how Noah is an inspiration to that. There's nothing, even in the magnetic field, left in the compass of the human heart. And he is the one having to live out something that no one will come alongside and understand or join. In fact, it'll be probably adversarial. It takes courage. It takes courage to be different. And not just be different, but maintain being different. And he maintained that. He had to live it out for 120 years. Wow. I don't know about you, but that is what strikes me the most. I don't know if it's my culture or my personality, but I'm one who's like, hey, I'm all for it, whatever you want to do. Okay, God, I'm up for this. Yesterday would be good, but tomorrow's cool too if you want to finish it tomorrow. But that's as long as I last, I'm like, good for a day. Let's pray, let's move. But if it's not something that is being moved upon that quickly, it's hard for me. 120 years, I'm like 120 days would feel long to hold on to something. I don't know if you identify with that, but this really speaks, I think, to some of us in terms of where we wrestle with God. And I've spoken with someone just, earlier this morning of how much it can be challenging to hold on to something for that kind of length of time. And our nature is one who might say, kind of like maybe Noah felt, maybe you have felt, well, if you're really for something, you go for it, man. You're all in, quick, let's do it. If you're passionate about something, you want it to happen yesterday. So obviously God doesn't really care because he's taking so long. But actually, the challenge I think that Noah reminds us of and what we see in God is that we call passion as often impulse. I'm excited about it for the moment. And if you catch in my excitement, I like really passionate. But is passion really the thing that is just all about quickness? Passion is about, we talk about the passion of Christ. It's the suffering of Christ. It's the enduring. See, God's passion is reflected in his patience. We're told, in the writer of Hebrews, Peter says, in his letter, he says that we think God is slow. Why is God not moving? Why is God not moving as fast, in things? It says God is not slow as some think of time. It's our concept of time that's so different. But it says rather, God is patient, or the same word is long-suffering. When the word is often read in Scripture of being patient, it means willing to suffer long. God is willing to suffer long for the sake of what? It says for the sake of redemption. For the sake that more people will be able to enter into the grace that he's holding open. And so God is long-suffering, and there's this long period of time in which humanity is things are kept open. And what he's, I think, working in Noah is out of that, a lot of the impulsiveness gets kind of worked out. Noah's going to have to realize that, man, I'm not in this thing for a week, a year, a decade. I'm in this thing for a long time. And out of that, you realize, okay, maybe faith isn't just a feeling. The feelings are going to come and go. And it's like, hey, I got a lot of faith. You catch me at the right moment, I'll declare a lot of faith. You know what? It's usually impulse. Not really faith. Just means I'm really excited and I'm feeling kind of optimistic. And we're really talking about optimism, a feeling, not necessarily faith. Faith is the stuff that has the courage to stand in that place of distinction for the long haul. You see, one of the things I feel like today is this whole idea of being different. It's like in vogue to be different. It's like if you ask people, well, like, what's your thing? I'm just different. It's like everybody's like into being different, which has its own ironies to it. It's like the mom who sees her girl going out the door, her teenage daughter, and she's got 2 different colored socks. And she's like, what are you doing? And the daughter says, hey, I have the right to be different. And after all, everybody's doing it. That's actually the way I feel like we live. It's like it's a very shallow sense of what it means to be different, this kind of in vogue, are you willing to be different? Hey, yeah, I wear this, I have my own little outfits, I have my own colored shirts, I wear something different than the kid next to me. What is this about? That is a very shallow sense of what it means to have courage to be different. Noah beckons the sense that this is going to run much deeper. It's going to run much deeper to hold on to that which you know. And I'm sure that he had days when he went out and he's like, this is crazy. I'm not feeling it, God. Everybody else is out there and I'm kind of alone. And my family's now full of tensions and I'm full of tensions and we're having tensions and I'm just not feeling it. But I think there's other times where he probably went, into the community and said, yeah. But God said there's consequences to what I see, and I see it. I'm seeing such violence, such exploitation. Probably things that we wouldn't even want to imagine were probably being played out. And I think he looked and he said, I do believe that there'll be consequences. And so, and maybe you're like that too. Sometimes you say, I don't get it, and sometimes you say, I do get it. I mean, this makes more sense than anything. And so it is. He lived in that. He stayed in that place. And then you come to that point in which we finally read Genesis 7:1. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous, which means rightness. There's a responsiveness in this generation. I found what I needed. So let's go. Come on in. You've held on. You've held on. And then it's interesting, in verse 10 it says something that I find ironic. It says, and after 7 days of them entering, the flood waters came on the earth. I don't know, that just strikes me as, come on, God, give the guy a break. They go into the ark after 120 years and they're like, so here, finally, at least everything we've given ourselves to, I guess there'll be some kind of, it's happening. And then they're in there. That must have been a long week. Everybody outside going, you know what? They're all in the boat. They got all the animals. What do they think? They're floating? Like they think there's water? There's nothing. Must have been a really long week. Must have been some real interesting discussions with his wife. And then the waters came. And it says they came from the skies and they came up from the waters broke forth. And at that moment you have to wonder what now begins to unfold as you have the wiping out of all life that he had known, people he'd known, all around him, and he's facing the consequences of their lives. Do you think he felt vindicated? Perhaps at some level he felt vindicated, but I think when you're staring at tragedy at that level, that's not he's seeing it all. I'm going to guess there's a sense of deep, sobering sadness going on. I don't think he doubts, though, because I think he's seen how evil can get. And I think he probably understood more than most why there has to be consequences. And that now he's living, and I think what grabbed him is he's living in the midst of grace. Because now he's amongst the only thing that's floating. He and his family and the potential for life going forward, he's in the midst of grace. And that is what we see in his faith, and it's where faith will hold us and keep us. We see that faith is the connection to the grace that God provides. Faith is that connection. This is that vessel of grace and that space of grace, and we need that. And what we find is that human history then goes forward as there is this ability to have maintained God's thread into a humanity. And one could argue that we're sitting here today because of the faithfulness of him. And God makes a covenant with him that now I will do something new in the future, but this will not take place like this again. And God says that, but there will ultimately be a greater covenant made in the future. And we find that this is merely a preview of what is to come. For as the vessel was a vessel of grace where there was protection from death, and one who entered into that vessel was protected, not because they deserved it, but because of God's grace, because they were willing to meet God and respond to him. So it is that God says he always knew that humanity would once again find itself getting so separated, so unresponsive, that ultimately God will finally come and bring that great judgment or consequences, if you will, to bear. And that when he does, although he will, that he says, he will have provided a way of grace, a vessel, if you will, to enter. And that way of grace is no longer the ark, no longer that, but the cross of Christ. That God comes and says, I will provide a way of grace. If you enter into that way of grace, the forgiveness of sins that Christ bears, that will be your protection. I've provided that way. And to come in to enter into that. And so he says, I'll make a new covenant, and that will only reflect but now fulfill what he has done before. And what is sobering is to realize that we do resonate, I think, with this story, as so many say. And it's become such a profound story. And the more you look, it tells us a lot about sin. It tells us a lot about the human heart. It tells us a lot about grace. But it also tells us a lot about the wrestling with the whole idea of consequences. And this is what Jesus said about this. Jesus himself, when he tells about you and I and anyone else who's looking to figure out, well, how does life end? Are there consequences? You may recall where Jesus says in Matthew 24 this, for as were what? The days of Noah. What you saw going on then, as humanity was unfolding then, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. When I return to establish the kingdom and the reign and rule, when I come to bring that and settle up things. For as in those days before the flood, they were what? They were carrying on, just carrying on life. They were eating and drinking, marrying and living in marriage, and until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware. They had no awareness in themselves. They were unresponsive, didn't grasp, until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so he puts before us that we will find ourselves facing similar dynamics. And I think as a culture we do. I think as a culture we are in many ways, more than for a long time, I don't think most people would say for massive time have people wanted so much to say there's no consequences to anything. That judgment is that thing we just want to say, judgment? No. There's no judgment for anything. Don't you judge me, and don't anybody judge me, and don't anyone tell they have a right to judge me. I do what I want, and the whole idea, come on. We just really say that we will never face anything. We got to do what we want, let everyone do what they want. There's no connection, no cause, no effect. That's the time we live in. And I think it's increasing quickly too, and I sense that. Nobody really can call anything a moral right anymore. You can't say that there's wrong or right, so no one knows what to appeal to anymore. So there's this kind of lostness that's beginning, this unraveling. And it's as if there's this kind of uncomfortable thread on the clothing. And it's like, oh, consequences. No, I don't believe in them. There's no judgment. Watch, and I just want to pull it up, but we can't break it. You just keep pulling, and it won't break off. And if you keep pulling, what happens? In the end, you're left naked. In the end, you're left naked, and you're standing before the reality of consequences. I feel like we've been trying to pull on this thread and break it out and get rid of it, but in the end, keep pulling, and you'll find that you're standing before the reality of consequences. And that's so much where I think we can find ourselves. And so the invitation is to realize, like no, you by faith hold on to that reality. By faith recognize that there are. By faith hold on to the natural sense that we know of the cause and effect. We live as people who might want to say that everything's random, there's no meaning, so therefore we're kind of free to come up with whatever we want. But the truth is, no one even comes close to living with consistency to that idea. It's just it's like an attempt at freedom, but it leaves us with actually an unsensical world because everyone knows that everything has consequences. We're just trying to pretend they don't. Everyone knows, everything points, everything shows, reveals it. That you don't have freedom without responsibility. It's just the thing we always want, freedom but no responsibility. You can't pull them apart. But we're trying so hard. And Noah's a reminder to us that if we're going to have a place that says, no, I'm going to stand in the place in which I stand responsible to God, responsive to God, I'm holding on to that faith. And I want to encourage you. You might be one who honestly is just trying to explore. I don't know what I believe. And my encouragement to you this morning, would you just say, all right, so God, reveal yourself to me. Like, help me to begin to grasp more truly. Speak to my heart. But I'm open. I'm willing to take this journey of faith. I'm willing to take a step of faith. But remember this. If we learn anything from this story, one of the things we realize is that we have to check the posture of our hearts. See, we will say, well, it's all about reason. No, it's not. Never has been. You will reason yourself to different conclusions based on what? Your desires of your heart. You will. Ask somebody who says that they don't believe in God, and I've had this conversation, it's respectfully. But one thing I've learned to ask is, do you want God to exist? It's a very interesting question. Because the answer to that question a lot of times has a lot more to do with what's really going on in the human heart. So we have to ask ourselves, do I authentically want it? In other words, if God was to make himself real, would that be good news to you or uh-oh news to you? That's a good question to ask too. Where's my heart in this? Where's my posture? And with that, ask God. Seek, go into that place. And for others of us, maybe we've just kind of lost our sense of passion. We're feeling like, well, you know what? I'm right in the middle of that 120 years. It's been a long time. And maybe we need to just take a hold afresh of the faith that Noah had. The courage that he had to stay that course and to say in the end, I'm glad that I'm in grace, that I'm glad I've got grace to have a life forever and to have a future. Let's pray. God, I just invite you in your hearts. If you're one who just realizes, I'm kind of in that place of just trying to settle, trying to take hold. I have some understanding, and I want my understanding to lead to conviction and lead to commitment. Then ask God to lead you in that. Just be honest with him. It's not a game. It's not something you have to do. It's not something you have to wear, but tell God you'll be honest and ask him to make himself known. That's between you and God. I just invite you if you're in that place. God, we come as those who, we live in a culture that is trying so hard to say there are no consequences, there could not be judgment, nothing will come and happen. And some of us just ask God that you would help us that you would help keep our minds very clear and connected. And that we might heed that warning like Noah, to realize that there are bigger things, and we might have the courage not to be different in the shallow ways of our culture, not merely in some kind of clothing or style, but really deep in our heart. It's not about style, but it's the story that we're going to live in, and that we might join what you're doing and have the courage to do it. We thank you for the grace that you have provided, and we just pray that you would lead us now, that you would deepen your work in our lives afresh. You would give us a grander sense of courage to stand in that place, more settled than ever. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.